Chapter 38. Their first night had been uneventful, save for Evelyn's groans as she lay in their small tent, trying unsuccessfully to ease the waves of pain that swept through her shoulder and thigh muscles. She and Alice had paddled for several hours across the placid waters of the lake, eventually landing on a small island. A quick scouting trip showed them that the island was uninhabited. It was barely more than a rock thrusting up out of the water, dotted with shrubs. They had made camp on a tiny sandy beach and settled in for the night. "There are mussels here I never knew I had," Evelyn told Alice the following morning. "And every one of them is burning like fire." Evelyn was fit and in excellent physical condition. The active life she led saw to that. But the action of paddling, hour after hour, had her using muscles that she never normally put under strain. Alice, more used to the motion, was stiff herself. But she knew it was worse for Evelyn. Still, she reasoned, there was nothing to gain by allowing the princess to wallow in misery. Evelyn's constant low moaning through the night had kept Alice awake, and this morning she was a little snappy about it. "You'll get used to it," she said. Evelyn looked at her sharply, saw she'd get no sympathy from that quarter, and set her mouth in a grim line, determined to show no further sign of discomfort. The water was boiling on the fire, and she took the kettle out of the coals and poured it into a small metal teapot, over the leaves of green tea they'd brought with them. "I wish we had coffee," she said. In her travels with the Rangers, she'd grown to like the beverage nearly as much as they did. She passed a cup to Alice, who was studying her map of the lake, planning the next stage. "Me too," Alice replied absent-mindedly. She sipped at the tea, enjoying its warmth, and spread the map on the sand between them. It was a simple chart. There was, after all, little to show on a map of the lake, aside from the islands that dotted its surface at irregular intervals. "Today will be a long day," she said. "The closest island to us is way over here." She tapped the map, indicating a landmass marked in the expanse of water. Evelyn looked at it, compared the distance to it and the distance they had already travelled, and whistled softly under her breath. "Whew, that's quite a way," she said. "There's nothing closer," Alice told her. "We're just going to have to do it, and I'd prefer to make it before dark. At least the wind hasn't got up." She knew from experience how difficult it could be paddling into a headwind. "I figure we're going to be paddling for 5, maybe 6 hours." Evelyn groaned softly. "Oh, and my aching arms and shoulders." "You'll be okay once we get going," Alice told her. "The kinks will ease out when you're working the muscles and you get warmed up." Evelyn began to gather up their breakfast utensils. She felt a little encouraged by Alice's comment. "Well, that's something at least." "Of course," Alice added, a trifle maliciously. "Once you cool down tonight and they stiffen up again, they're going to hurt like merry hell." Evelyn paused in the act of strapping her travel pack shut. "Well, thank you for those kind words of encouragement," she said. "It's nice to know I have that to look forward to." They packed their supplies into the kayak and pushed it clear of the beach. Once again, Evelyn climbed in first, still a little clumsily, while Alice held the boat steady. Then Alice boarded as well. This time, when the boat rocked suddenly under her weight, Evelyn didn't tense up. The previous day had seen her grow accustomed to the fact that their little craft moved on the water. It rocked and plunged from time to time. But she'd learned that such movements didn't presage sudden disaster. Once she managed to relax, she found that she could counteract the kayak's motion with a loose muscled response, balancing her weight without panic or tension. Her paddling still left a little to be desired, and from time to time she miscued a stroke, sending a shower of near-freezing water splashing back over her companion. The first few times this happened, Alice had responded with icy politeness. "Thank you for that, Your Majesty." After that, her comments were less audible, consisting of indecipherable mutterings. Each time, Evelyn gritted her teeth and resolved not to make the same mistake again. Inevitably, she did, and had to endure more of the almost, but not quite, inaudible comments from the rear seat. Comments that she knew were unladylike and uncomplimentary in the extreme. But there was nothing she could do about it, as she realized that she was in the wrong each time she unwittingly threw a faceful of water at Alice. They paused every 30 minutes or so to rest. When the sun passed the midday mark, Alice announced that they could take a break to eat and drink. They sat drifting on the lake, lulled by the now familiar pock, pock, pock of the wavelets against their hull. There was little wind and no current, so they tended to stay pretty much in one position. When they had rested, but before Evelyn's muscles had time to cool and stiffen, Alice called a start again. She had a North Seeker needle with her, and she turned the kayak to face west of northwest, then began to paddle once more. As the little boat moved off, Evelyn glanced back over her shoulder to get the timing of the stroke and joined in. The kayak surged forward under the increased thrust, then yawed as Evelyn missed a stroke and threw more spray into Alice. "Thank you so much," Alice said. Evelyn said nothing. She had apologized so many times that the words now seemed meaningless. Besides, Alice should know by now that she wasn't doing it on purpose. Grimly, she concentrated on her paddling, digging the blade deep into the water and finishing the stroke before she raised it again. This time, a good 40 minutes passed before Alice caught another bladeful of water in the face. "Thank you so much," she said mechanically. Evelyn wished her companion would come up with something new to say, or revert to her bad-tempered muttering. In the mid-afternoon, the wind rose, blowing sharply across their course from the southwest. Alice had to consult the North Seeker more frequently to keep them on course. The wind also raised a spiteful little cross-swell, and larger waves than they had previously encountered began to slap against the left-hand side of the bow of the kayak. Spray sloshed over the gunwales and into the boat. At first, it was no more than an inconvenience and a discomfort as the icy cold water swirled around their feet. But as more and more water slopped in, the little boat became heavier. "I'll keep paddling. You bail her out for a while," Alice ordered. They both leaned to the side as Evelyn stowed her paddle down the inside of the little boat, then took the bailing bucket that Alice passed forward to her. "Mind the skin of the boat," Alice warned her, as she scooped water out of the bottom of the kayak and tossed it overboard. Unthinkingly, she threw the first bucketful over the left or windward side. A good proportion of it was caught by the wind and flung back over the two of them. "Thank you for that," Alice said. "Sorry," Evelyn said. Next time, she threw the water to the right. It was a wet and cold and exhausting afternoon. Evelyn's arm muscles, shoulders and elbows were aching from the alternate actions of paddling and bailing. Alice stayed doggedly to her task of paddling throughout, and in spite of the acid comments when Evelyn accidentally soaked her, Evelyn felt a growing admiration for the tall girl's strength and endurance. Alice never flagged, keeping the narrow craft driving forward through the waves. "At least," she said at one point, her words coming between grunts of exertion, "this wind is giving me something to steer by. So as long as I keep it on our left front quarter, we're heading more or less for the island." "Unless it shifts," Evelyn said, sending another bucketful overboard. There was a long silence. Finally, Alice spoke again. Hadn't thought of that. Better check. The kayak gradually slowed and sagged off downwind as Alice stopped paddling and produced her North Seeker. It took a few minutes for the needle to settle, then she grunted in satisfaction. No, it's held steady. Let's go. Evelyn had used the brief stop to clear most of the water out of the boat. She took up her paddle again and joined Alice in driving the boat forward, quickly regaining the distance they had lost as they drifted. Her shoulders were on fire. No more groaning, she told herself grimly, as she bit the side of her mouth to prevent herself from making a sound. Head down, she reached forward with the paddle, placed it in the water, and dragged the boat forward. Then she lifted it out, feathering the blade as she did so, and reached forward on the other side. With each stroke, her shoulder muscles and the muscles on the underside of her upper arms sent shafts of pain stabbing through her. But she was determined not to stop before Alice did. No more groaning, just keep going. The unspoken words formed a rhythm in her mind, and she worked to it, hearing the two phrases like a strange mantra. At least I'm not cold, she thought. Although her feet and hands were frozen, she could feel perspiration on her body. She paddled on, determined not to stop before Alice did. The light was fading now as the winter sun sank low to the horizon. Her viewpoint was confined to the sharp prow of the kayak ahead of her and the pewter-coloured water around her. No more groaning, just keep going. Over and over again. Stretch, thrust, pull, lift. Stretch, thrust, pull, lift. She hated the lake. Hated the icy water. Hated the paddle. Hated the kayak. Hated everything about this journey. And above all, she hated Alice. We've made it, Alice said. We're there. Evelyn could have kissed her. She looked up, and there was the island, 50 meters away. It was larger than the one they had camped on the previous night, and there were trees here, where there had been nothing but low shrubs on the other island. They dragged the boat up onto a shingle beach, then fell exhausted to the ground, both groaning in agony as they lay there. Alice gave them a few minutes of rest before she roused Evelyn, shaking her shoulder. Come on, she said. We have to set up camp before we stiffen up. As Evelyn rose wearily to her feet, she decided that she had been too quick to forgive Alice. She hated her again. But she also knew the tall girl was right. Staggering with weariness, they built a fire and pitched their tent close to it. Then they changed out of their sweat-dampened inner clothing and fell on their bedrolls, pulling their blankets around them, too tired to eat. The long, mournful howl penetrated through the fog of exhaustion that had wrapped around Evelyn, bringing her awake. Had it been close by or far away? She had no way of telling. She'd been asleep when the cry came. Maybe, she thought, she had dreamed it. Then it came again, and she knew it was real. And it was close. It sounded as if it were only a few meters away from the back of the tent. Alice, she said uncertainly. Nobody could have slept through that noise, she thought. What is it? That's what I want to know. It sounded like a wolf. Are there wolves on these islands? Well, it certainly didn't sound like a kitty cat, did it? Alice threw off her blankets and crouched in the low headroom of the tent, fumbling with the gear stowed beside her bed. Outside, the fire they had built up before going to sleep was almost dead. A few yellow flames flickered and cast weird shadows on the tent walls. Evelyn heard the quick hiss of a blade being drawn and saw Alice with her sabre in her hand. Where are you going? Out to see what all the noise is, Alice told her. Hastily, Evelyn tossed off her blankets and scrabbled around in the dim light for her own sword. She pulled on her boots, leaving them unlaced, and followed Alice as she crept on hands and knees out of the tent. Oh dear, Alice said as she emerged. Evelyn joined her a few seconds later, and she pointed to the half-circle of grey shapes ranged around the campsite, at the edge of the pool of light thrown by the fire. "Wolves," Evelyn said. "Are they likely to attack?" Alice shrugged. "I don't know, but my guess is they didn't just come here to pass the time of day. At least the fire seems to be keeping them back." There was only a handful of firewood left, a few branches that they had left to rekindle the fire in the morning. Evelyn threw 2 of them onto the small pile of coals and flame. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the intense heat of the coals asserted itself, and the 2 new branches caught and flared up. The semicircle of silent watchers edged back a few paces. Alice glanced around. The wolves were on the inland side of the camp. The way to the kayak and the lake beyond was clear. "Back into the tent," she said. "Grab your pack. We're making for the kayak." "The kayak? What are—" Alice cut her off. "You can wait here until the fire dies down and see what the wolves have in mind if you like," she said. "I'm launching the kayak and sitting offshore till morning." "Can wolves swim?" Evelyn asked doubtfully, although Alice's idea seemed logical. Alice shrugged. "Not as fast as I can paddle when I'm terrified," she said. "And if any do come after us, we can brain them with the paddles. Now let's get moving, unless you've got a better idea." They backed towards the tent. As they did so, the wolves edged in closer, still staying on the rim of the pool of firelight. Inside, they hastily shoved clothes and gear back into their packs. Then, still carrying their bare swords, they emerged once more. A rumbling growl went round the half-circle of grey watchers. The firelight was down to a few low flames now. "Don't turn your back on them," Alice said. Carefully, they backed away from the campsite towards the kayak. As they went, 2 of the wolves rose and started to pad slowly after them. Alice raised her sword and hissed a challenge at them. The steel caught the red light of the fire and reflected it around the camp. The wolves stopped. The girls moved off again, and the wolves kept pace with them. Evelyn took a light grip on Alice's jacket. Looking over her shoulder, she steered the other girl towards the kayak. "You watch them, I'll watch the boat," she said. Alice grunted in reply. She had feared that the wolves might try a flanking movement, circling round to put themselves between the 2 girls and the boat. But the animals had no idea what the long, narrow shape was. As far as they could see, they had these strange creatures trapped against the water. They stopped, and Alice could see the kayak in her peripheral vision. "Get in the water," she said, "and get aboard." Evelyn heaved and got the boat moving, sliding across the small pebbles and into the water. She moved it offshore a few minutes, waiting as Alice backed after her, her sword still presented to the following wolves. Evelyn sheathed her own sword. She didn't want to risk its sharp edge cutting the oilskin covering of the boat, and sat clumsily into the boat. It rocked wildly for a few seconds, but she rode the motion and waited till it steadied. She stowed her sword and took up her paddle. "Get in," she said, and Alice splashed hastily through the shallows to the boat. The 2 wolves who had been shadowing them bounded to the water's edge, then stopped, uncertainly. Alice was swinging her legs into the boat as Evelyn was already stroking backwards away from the beach. One of the wolves threw back his head and howled in frustration. "I guess that means they don't swim," Alice said. "It also means we don't go back ashore," Evelyn replied. But Alice shook her head. "They'll be gone by daylight," she said. "We'll have to go back anyway to get our camping gear. At least they won't bother that, although they'll probably eat our food supplies." "Great," said Evelyn. They paddled until they were about 100 meters offshore, then rested to take stock of their situation. The wind had died down after sunset. It was now a gentle breeze, although that was enough to set them drifting away from the island. Evelyn remembered something she had seen long ago when she and Will had been captives aboard Iraq's ship Wolfwind. She tied a length of light rope to the bailer and tossed it over the bow, where it filled with water and streamed behind them. "It's called a sea anchor," she explained. "It'll stop us drifting too far." Alice was impressed. "And you said you were pig ignorant when it came to boats." "I don't remember saying that," Evelyn replied with a frown. Alice shrugged. "Oh, well, it must have been me." When dawn came, they paddled back to the beach, having dozed fitfully in turns through the dark hours of the morning. They gathered up their camping gear, spare clothes, and blankets from where the wolves had tossed them as they had looked through their belongings for anything edible. There was a sack of rice split open and spilled on the sand, and they carefully gathered it up again. There was no sign of the wolves. But the girls knew they were still there, still watching.